I don't think this is a tax plan. I think it's a tax scam. I think it's a heist. I think that the middle class in this country is not going to benefit from this. Middle class Americans that are hoping for a tax break for the holidays are going to be sorely disappointed. Maybe a few lumps of coal that they get. And in fact, polling shows across the country that this is the singularly most unpopular bill that Congress has considered in a very long time. 75% of Americans across this country don't think it's a good idea. And you know what? They're not fooled by the promises that are being made about what this bill does. Let's really talk about what this bill does. We know that the wealthiest will benefit. The wealthiest 1% will receive 50% of the tax cuts. And in 2019, 18% of the tax cuts in this bill will go to the wealthiest 1%. But by 2027, that number climbs to 62% with an average tax cut of $33,000. What else do we know about this bill? We know that the largest corporations will benefit. To pay for this massive tax cut for corporations, the Senate tax bill would repeal the individual mandate part of the Affordable Care Act, something that Republicans have tried to do over and over again this year. The American people have spoken up and said, no, we know that health care is a right, not a privilege. We want our health care. We know the Affordable Care Act is not perfect, but it has done much to protect the health care of people across this country. And yet, in spite of that, now the individual mandate, the repeal of the individual mandate, has been put into the Senate tax bill, and it would result in 13 million people more being uninsured. It would also result in a 10% increase in premiums for Americans across the country, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And we know also that this bill is wholly fiscally irresponsible. And it's funny, for years, Republicans have yelled and screamed about deficits, the huge deficits that we have. And yet this bill would add between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion in deficits to what we already have. And that would lead to a mandatory cut in critical programs. But let's just talk for a minute about what exactly this tax scam will mean for ordinary Americans across the country. In order to pay for the tax cuts that we've talked about for the wealthiest and the largest corporations, it means that millions of working families and poor folks across this country are going to end up paying more. Not only that, there are incentives in this bill that would actually create an incentive for American companies to take jobs off of Main Street, close factories here in the United States, and move those jobs overseas. It will make it harder for families to make ends meet. The Senate bill would raise taxes on 78 million middle-class families, and millions of families across the country would lose their health care. In my district alone, nearly 31,000 constituents would lose their health care. This bill would also put real roadblocks in the way of young people looking to get ahead. You know, two of the eliminations of tax exemptions in this tax bill that offend me the most and should offend all Americans across the country are, number one, there's essentially a tax on being sick. There's a tax on long-term care for Americans across this country. Right now, if you have a family member who's in long-term care or has a serious illness, the expenses that you pay for that individual, for that family member, you can deduct those medical expenses. With this tax scam, the tax heist that's being proposed, you would no longer be able to deduct those medical expenses. So you're being taxed for being ill or for needing care as you get older. But in addition, we're taxing education. We already know that there's $1.4 trillion in student loan debt across this country, more than even credit card debt in this country. Young people have to make these terrible choices about whether they're going to go into debt, $80,000, or whether they're going to get whether they're just not going to go and get a higher education. That is wrong. And this bill, this tax bill, would actually take away some of the tax benefits that we give to graduate students, for example, when they get help to be able to complete their graduate education. It would take away the exemption that currently exists. If you're a teacher and you buy pencils or paper or supplies for your classroom, that is currently a deductible expense. It would take that away for teachers, but not for corporations. If corporations buy supplies, that's tax deductible, but not if you're a teacher. That is just crazy. It prioritizes the wealthy by allowing wealthy families to avoid the estate tax. Let's talk about the estate tax for just a minute. The estate tax is 5,400 families across the country that pay that, very, very small number of the wealthiest families. But in fact, what this does is it says, no, that's even too much. We're going to double the exemption. So now $11 million, even fewer families are going to pay that, but it's going to cost middle-class families a couple of $100 billion in revenue. The experts across the spectrum are arriving at the same conclusion. This bill is bad for regular working families. The National Association of Realtors has said this: the Senate tax bill puts home values at risk and dramatically undercuts the incentive to own a home. Our estimates show that home values stand to fall by an average of more than 10% and even greater in high-cost areas. How about the Fraternal Order of Police? The FOP is very concerned that the partial or total elimination of the state and local tax deduction, something very important to my state, my home state of Washington, would endanger the ability of our state and local government to actually fund these agencies and recruit the men and women we need to keep us safe. That's a quote from the Fraternal Order of Police. The American Council on Education has said this: as a result, we're deeply concerned that at a time when post-secondary degrees and credentials have never been more important to individuals, the economy, and our society, the tax reform proposal approved by the Senate could make college more expensive and undermine the financial stability of higher education institutions. Let's be clear about what's happening here. The Republicans have a plan. And that plan, it's like a little three-step dance. First, transfer trillions of dollars of wealth from middle-class families and the poorest amongst us to the wealthiest corporations who are already not paying their fair share. Second, when you do that transfer, explode the deficit. So the estimates are $1.4, $1.5 trillion would be added to the deficit. And then finally, use the fact that you're exploding the deficit to actually cut programs that are critical to Americans across the country. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We know that as written, this bill would trigger mandatory spending cuts to Medicare and Medicaid of significant amounts. So the reality is that we are in a situation where this is incredibly unpopular. The polling shows right now that Americans are not buying this tax scam. 68% say that the tax bill helps the wealthiest. 54% say the tax bill favors biggest Republican donors. 61% say that Medicare and Social Security cuts would ultimately end up being the vehicle that's used to pay for these tax cuts to the wealthiest. And 68% say that changes to the Affordable Care Act should not be in this tax bill. So here's where we are. The House passed its bill on November 16th, and in the early hours of December 2nd, just last Friday, the Senate passed its version. So we're going into conference committee now, which means that a group of legislators from the House and a group of legislators from the Senate get together and they try to work out the differences between the two bills. And then ultimately, whatever that compromise is, if it's worked out, would come back for a vote to the House and the Senate. So now more than ever, we need the voices of people across the country to call and to talk about the concerns that working people across this country have. We do need a real reform of the tax system to simplify it, to make sure that people are paying their fair share, but that's not what this is. This is a tax scam. It's a heist. It's transfer of trillions of dollars in wealth from middle-class families and the most vulnerable to the wealthiest who do not need that money. The reality is that we need to be investing in the American people. We need to be investing in jobs, in education. We need to be making sure that middle-class families are getting a break, that they can actually think about a generation for a future for their kids, for the next generation that is better than the one they have. So we have very little time. But Representative Raskin, I'm very sure that we in the Progressive Caucus and we in the Democratic Caucus are going to do everything we can to fight for working people, for the most vulnerable among us, and to protect things like CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, to protect temporary protected status for immigrants across the country, to make sure we're passing a Clean Dream Act. These are the kinds of priorities we should be focusing on, not lining the pockets of the wealthiest corporations and transferring jobs from the United States to tax havens elsewhere. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure that in this very short period of time, people speak up and speak out and make sure that we do not pass this bill, make sure that we instead work together in a bipartisan way for a tax reform that actually benefits working families. And with that, Representative Raskin, I yield back to you, and again, thank you for your leadership on the Progressive Caucus.